Welcome to today's webinar, the 2016 election, What It Means for Maryland. I'm Danny Jacobs, legal editor of the Daily Record. On Tuesday, Donald J. Trump won one of the most contentious presidential elections in modern American political history to become the 45th President of the United States. Republicans also maintained their grip on Congress, keeping the majority in both the Senate and the House. Maryland elected a new U.S. Senator, Chris Van Hollen, to replace the retiring Barbara Mikulski, and voters in Baltimore elected a new mayor, Democrat Catherine Pugh. You can read about the impact of the election in today's Daily Record, where we have stories about how the election will affect the judiciary at the federal and state levels, as well as what the results mean for Maryland's political landscape. But for a more in-depth look at the election fallout, we have four experienced leaders today who will offer their insights and views on what Tuesday's results mean to the people, issues, institutions, and economy of Maryland. Our panelists are Donald C. Fry, President and CEO of the Greater Baltimore Committee, Ronald Weich, Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law, Carmel Rokes, CEO of Keswick, and Mary Ann Scully, President and CEO of Howard Bank. Each of our panelists will join us for about 15 minutes. Before we begin, some brief housekeeping. If you're registered for the webinar and are listening in, you are muted so we cannot hear you. But you can ask a question for our panelists by typing it into the Ask Question chat window on the webinar's control panel. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. If you are not seeing a control panel, click on the orange arrow in the upper right-hand corner of your webinar screen. With us first is Don Fry. Since 2002, he has been the President and CEO of the Greater Baltimore Committee, which is comprised of business and civic leaders in the Central Maryland region. He has spent years working on policy issues and the competitive challenges facing Maryland today. Don is a former member of both the Maryland House and Senate and is one of the few legislators ever to serve on each major budget committee in both chambers. Don, thanks for joining us today.
Danny, great. Thanks for being with you.
I want to start with local politics. And what are the most pressing challenges you think facing Mayor-elect Catherine Pugh and the new City Council that's coming in December?
Well, I think one of the most pressing challenges that both Mayor-elect Pugh and the new City Council members have, of course, is just transitioning into office. Obviously, transitioning from campaigning to actual governing are two different things. And one of the challenges for Catherine Pugh is transitioning from a legislative role to an executive role. I think the city really needs the mayor-elect to be a transformational leader. That's somebody who can inspire positive changes, and the people will follow what she wants. I think she certainly has the energetic, enthusiastic, and passionate appeal to do those types of things, but that's going to be a whole new skill set that she's going to have to bring forward. As far as the new City Council, we're having 8 new members of the City Council majority, and they're going to have a period of time where they have to learn about the budget, learn about the policies and the processes of city operations, and then move into actually how they are going to govern. But there are a number of challenges facing Baltimore City, ranging from the public safety issue to dealing with our aging infrastructure, whether it be water, sewer, or a need for citywide broadband, then areas like the new arena or an expanded convention center. There's significant concerns about our education system and our job training and job growth in the city, and how we can provide better opportunities for young people and individuals perhaps with lower levels of education to move into career path operations. So there's a lot of challenges facing Baltimore City, and I think all these are issues that the mayor-elect and the new City Council are going to have to deal with, on top of just the fact that Baltimore took a hit from the cable coverage of the unrest a number of years ago, and although great things are moving forward in Baltimore, it certainly has had an impact on our image and our reputation, and I know that that's something that everybody wants to address moving forward.
How much of the Freddie Gray fallout do you think is still going to be on the new mayor and city council? We're kind of moved away from what happened back in April 2015, but do you think it's still going to be a pressing issue for this new administration to face?
Well, I'm not so sure that we really have moved past the issue with Freddie Gray. I think there's a number of underlying circumstances and challenges we still need to deal with. I know that there's concern about making sure that we make proper investments into our neighborhoods and our communities, that we provide job opportunities for individuals at all levels of education and job skills, make sure we develop job skill programs for individuals that perhaps don't have the type of skills that are needed in the new economy moving forward. So there's a number of other challenges that we still need to address that are outcomes from the Freddie Gray situation.
Have you spoken with the mayor-elect yet?
Oh yeah, we've had an opportunity to cross paths a number of times, and I know she's been very busy both with the election as well as getting her thoughts together, and of course she's been spending a number of months with a protracted period of time that we had between the primary and the general, hearing from hundreds of people about what they think she needs to do moving forward, and I think she's trying to take all that into consideration and then also put her priorities in order as well.
The outgoing administration of Stephanie Rawlings Blake was a strong supporter of tax credits to spur economic development. Do you see that continuing in the Pugh administration?
I think moving forward, you're going to have to see some form of tax credits. I mean, we've seen the success of some tax credits. Baltimore is one of the top 10 cities in the country when it comes to millennials who are attracted to our city. Part of the reason is the ability to use tax credits to convert former commercial buildings into residential apartment complexes, particularly in the downtown area, but really across the entire city. That's just one example of where tax credits have been successful. So I think that the use of tax credits, where appropriate, is something that's going to continue to be moving forward. And I think that it's something that we need in the city to give us that competitive advantage to other jurisdictions, some who have those tax credits and others who are striving to get those tax credits moving forward.
Another form of government assistance that has blossomed in Baltimore and elsewhere is tax increment financing, or TIFs, which have been approved most recently for the Port Covington project, the Under Armour project here in Baltimore. Do you see those continuing in the Pugh administration?
Well, I think, again, that's going to be on a case-by-case basis. TIFs or pilots certainly are effective financing tools for economic development, major economic development projects. All of those need to be properly structured and vetted to make sure that they are beneficial not only for the developer, but also for as a tool for spurring that economic development and for the city as a whole. You know, so I think that you're still going to see that, but I think appropriately TIFs and pilots need to be looked at closely and determine whether or not they do meet the criteria that are essential to be beneficial, mutually beneficial to the developer and the city. You know, I think we've seen through the Port Covington TIF that there are a number of different factors that need to be considered, whether it be components of a community benefit agreement and things of that nature, working with the neighborhoods. So I think what might be helpful in the process would be for the city to look at the process, maybe give some clarity as to exactly what they think are some of the components that should be considered in those community benefit agreements, and give some predictability to businesses that are looking to maybe apply for a TIF or a pilot moving forward.
I was going to ask about the community benefits agreement. That was one negotiated with Sagamore Development, which is behind Port Covington, and the city of Baltimore. Do you think those will be common features of TIFs, future TIFs, should there be more of them?
I don't think it's uncommon that we've seen in any TIF that there's been engaging with the neighborhood leaders. I think there certainly was done so at the Port Covington TIF, perhaps more than other prior projects that moved forward. But I think that they did a great job in engaging many neighborhood leaders and others to make sure that we had economic and other benefits from the project moving forward. I think it will serve as a model. It's not something that people are going to apply directly, because I think each and every project has its own assets and benefits and also challenges that have to be addressed. But I certainly think it'll be something that's looked at, and should expect as a developer to have some form of neighborhood engagement, community benefit agreement moving forward, if you want to have the benefit of having that sort of financing support from the government.
There are a number of infrastructure improvements and major transportation projects sought for Baltimore and Maryland as a whole. What is your sense of the willingness of a Trump administration to be financial partners in those projects?
Well, I think it's certainly too early to tell exactly where the Trump administration is going to stand with respect to major infrastructure improvements or major transportation projects. We didn't hear a whole lot of specific details during the campaign, although we did hear from President-elect Trump that he wanted to see the country's roads and other infrastructure, he saw the need for an improvement, and we needed to make some investment in that area. So I think that that's certainly encouraging, and we need to make sure that we press that from a state level. Our delegation is going to have to work hard to build relationships with the Republican administration to make sure that key state projects like the Howard Street Tunnel and also maybe the improvements on I-95 into Port Covington and many other projects move forward. So that's going to be a challenge, but I think also a priority, not only for our congressional delegation, but also Governor Hogan, who wants to see some of those projects move forward as well.
You mentioned the Howard Street Tunnel overhaul. Is it, again, still too early to tell how a Trump administration might affect that project?
I think it's too early to tell, but I think there's no doubt that the Howard Street Tunnel is one of those projects that is not just a local or even a statewide project, but has some national impact from a business perspective. So I think that that's the type of project that I think a Trump administration may look positively on, recognizing the importance of connecting the Port of Baltimore to all of the markets out in the Midwest and making it much easier for the Port of Baltimore to grow in light of the expansion of the Panama Canal and Baltimore being one of the few ports on the East Coast that's capable of handling that enhanced size vessel.
We only have a couple more minutes left with Don, so if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them. And Don, you also mentioned a little earlier about the congressional delegation working with the new administration. We knew going into Tuesday that no matter who won the Senate race between Kathy Szeliga and Chris Van Hollen, that the seat was being vacated by Barbara Mikulski, who was a senior member in the Senate. How big of a problem, if any, do you see this for the congressional delegation's efforts to make sure it gets its share of federal dollars, with Mikulski leaving in January?
Well, Senator Mikulski leaving is certainly a significant impact to the state because she's been such a staunch supporter for the state and also for Baltimore. But I personally know Chris Van Hollen, served with him both in the House of Delegates and Senate, and know that he is a very effective and strong legislator. I think he's well respected already in the halls of Congress from his work in the House of Representatives. So I think Senator Cardin and now Senator-elect Van Hollen will still work very well together and can support the state of Maryland. We also are fortunate in that our delegation is united in its efforts for the state to get its fair share of federal dollars. We also have, although largely a Democratic delegation, Congressman Andy Harris is a candidate for a top seat with the Republican Caucus Research Group, certainly which would position him to be a leader for the state to receive funding. And of course, Congressman Cummings and Ruppersberger, Sarbanes, and Delaney are all very well respected and have served there for the last couple of terms and have their own reputations that I think will help us. So I think, although it's tough to lose someone like Senator Mikulski, who is in such a key position and had such seniority, our delegation is still going to be strong, which is one of the benefits we've had for many years in Maryland.
The state's economy, for better or for worse, wisely or not, is somewhat dependent on federal government spending. Do you anticipate any changes in the Trump administration of the federal dollars coming to the state?
Well, again, I think we haven't seen all the details, but I think we got some insight from the campaign on a number of different levels. First of all, we heard from the campaign that President-elect Trump wants to see a strong national defense. Obviously, Maryland, with all of its defense companies in the region and also with its federal facilities and military installations, would benefit from that strong defense spending portion. Also, of course, we're seeing an increasingly level of concern dealing with cybersecurity. And I think when you look at the Baltimore-Washington area, we recognize that that area is an epicenter for cybersecurity with a huge number of companies who've been working in that area both for national defense as well as for commercial purposes. So I think that, absent another sequestration, which is may not happen with a we may not have that same gridlock since we both have a Republican House of Representatives and a Republican Senate and also a Republican president. We may, without having that sort of a sequestration problem, I think Maryland will still do well in that area.
Don, I appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Danny. It's been great.
Our next guest is Ronald Weich, Dean of the University of Baltimore School of Law. Ron was named Dean of the School of Law in 2012, following a long career in government in which he served as an Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice during the Obama administration and as Chief Counsel to U.S. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and the late Senator Ted Kennedy. He has written extensively on federal sentencing and other criminal law topics and has played a role in the judicial confirmation process and in the legislative revisions to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Welcome, Ron. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Very glad to be with you.
One of the biggest talking points for Republicans in the Trump campaign during the campaign season was that a vote for Trump would block Hillary Clinton from appointing Supreme Court justices and creating a more liberal court. I think it's safe to say now that Merrick Garland's chances of joining the bench are gone. But what do you think happens to the Supreme Court now under President Trump?
Well, it's certainly true that Hillary Clinton won't be appointing Supreme Court justices. So those who voted for Donald Trump on that basis are achieving their goal. It remains to be seen what kind of justices Donald Trump might appoint. He actually, during the campaign, published two lists of individuals who he said he would consider for the Supreme Court, and they consisted largely of judges, although there was one senator on the list, Senator Mike Lee of Utah, several federal judges, and a number of state Supreme Court judges. There was nobody on the list from the Fourth Circuit or from the Maryland Court of Appeals, so we won't see any of our neighbors on the Trump list. But once he nominates somebody, and of course he has a vacancy in the death early last year of Justice Scalia, we'll see what the Senate does with his nomination. The Senate Democrats, at least for now, have the opportunity to filibuster a nomination, but it may be that the Senate Republicans would change the rules to prohibit such extended debate on a Trump nomination. So it's too early to say who we might see and how that nominee would be treated in the Senate.
The Democrats did remove the filibuster option from Republicans a couple years ago, correct? So it would kind of be a tit for tat.
This is in 2013, and there's a history here going back to 2005. The Republicans wanted to change the rules when George Bush was president, and the Democrats blocked that effort. And then in 2013, the Democrats changed the rules. Republicans opposed it at that time. But the rule change, as it currently stands, only blocks filibusters of district court and court of appeals nominees, not Supreme Court nominees. However, if the Republican senators wanted to speed a Trump nominee through the process, they may alter the rules again and would cite the 2013 action by Senate Democrats as a precedent.
Do you think we'll see a Supreme Court nominee from President Trump in his first, say, 100 days in office? Is it a big top priority for him?
I would think so, and the vacancy is there because Justice Scalia died in early 2015.
There are also some vacancies.
I'm sorry, early 2016. Early 2016, right. So early this year.
There are also some vacancies at the Federal District Court and Federal Circuit Court appeals level, and people have talked about a vacancy crisis in some court jurisdictions due to a lack of confirmations of President Obama's federal court nominees. How will that change, if at all, under President Trump?
Well, for many years, the two parties have traded accusations about unfair treatment of nominees. Frankly, I expect that to continue. However, because of the rules change in 2013, a Republican-controlled Senate will be in a position to process nominations from a Republican president fairly quickly. There are certainly opportunities for debate, but there won't be the opportunity to block nominations. We'll have to see whether the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who I expect will continue to be Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, whether he will respect what's called the blue slip tradition, under which home state senators could stop a nominee from moving forward. So if President Trump were to nominate somebody to the District of Maryland, and Senators Cardin and Van Hollen opposed that nominee, under the tradition, that nominee would not move forward, but we'll see if that tradition continues.
Do you think we'll see an ideological shift in the judiciary under President Trump?
Yes, I think there's little doubt that he has a judicial philosophy and the people around him have a philosophy that is different than President Obama's philosophy. They will be drawing candidates from a different pool than President Obama did.
Is it something you think we'll see overnight, or do you think this will take a couple of years or even maybe longer than that to see sort of the effects of his appointments?
Naturally, it will grow over time as there are more and more Trump nominees, more Trump judges sitting on the federal benches throughout the country. In the Supreme Court, a replacement for Justice Scalia could hardly be more conservative, so we wouldn't see a shift from the court as it existed before Justice Scalia's death. But even now, we'll see a difference from how the 8-member court has been proceeding if there is a very conservative nominee on the court from President Trump.
During the campaign, Donald Trump touted himself as a law and order candidate. How will his administration affect the criminal justice reform movement, which certainly has been a major issue in Maryland at the state level?
Right, at the state level and in Congress, there's been some movement to reform, for example, mandatory minimum sentencing laws, to deal with police brutality, policing issues. And so that has actually been a bipartisan issue, and many Republicans have favored changing our approach to criminal justice. However, some of the people who seem to be Donald Trump's advisors haven't been in that camp. So certainly former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, New York City Mayor Giuliani, has been skeptical of these reforms. Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, who seems to be a key advisor to Mr. Trump, doesn't seem to favor these reforms. And so it's really unclear whether that bipartisan movement towards more rational criminal justice policies will continue.
President Obama has recently, at least, made several commutations of sentences. He's been sort of getting nonviolent drug offenders out of prison who may have had long terms. Do you think President Trump would be as willing to commute sentences the way President Obama has been?
I would be surprised if the process continues without interruption, because there will be a period when the Justice Department is in transition. There'll be a new Attorney General, there'll be new advisors to the Attorney General, there'll be a new White House counsel and advisors to that person, and so they'll have to take stock and decide how they want to proceed. Had Hillary Clinton been elected, I would have thought that process would simply continue because she was fully on board with President Obama's approach to that issue. I don't know that President Trump will completely abandon that effort. It remains to be seen. Those of us who favor that kind of approach to criminal justice certainly have to be concerned about the preeminence of Mayor Giuliani and Governor Christie in President-elect Trump's inner circle.
We have a question from one of our listeners, and it's is there any remaining process by which the Supreme Court vacancy can be filled by the Obama administration?
Well, President Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, is there in the chamber. There is going to be a lame duck session, but it seems entirely unlikely, to say the least, that the Republican majority, which has refused to move the nomination this entire year, would take it up now. And then at the beginning of the new Congress, the new Congress will convene on January 3rd, and the new president won't take office until January 20th. But there again, why would the Republican majority take action on a nominee of President Obama, even if President Obama were to renominate Judge Garland? The only thing I would say is, if you're interested in this general subject, I'd encourage the webinar listeners to attend a session that we're going to have at the University of Baltimore School of Law next Wednesday night at 5 o'clock. Lyle Denniston, who's a very respected Supreme Court reporter, been observing the court for many years, is going to speak about Supreme Court nominations, and I'm going to be in a discussion with him about that, and we're certainly going to take account of the developments in the election and speculate about the course of the Supreme Court under President Trump. And that's here at the law school.
Much has been made of government surveillance programs that have been uncovered during the Obama administration. How does President Trump go about balancing respect for civil rights with the responsibility to keep the country safe?
You know, Donald Trump as a candidate expressed impatience with civil liberties, and constitutional protections. You'll remember he said at one point he favored torture or worse for terrorism suspects, and had other things to say about anti-terror policies that were frankly alarming to those of us who do believe in a balance. I think it's too early to say how he will approach this as a president as opposed to a candidate. We'll need to see who's around him. I will say that there are career officials in the law enforcement agencies and the intelligence community who will be a significant restraint on any president. President Trump will not have a free hand in these matters. Certainly a president is very influential in this and other areas, but there are structural constraints on any president, and so I wouldn't expect a dramatic change in policies overnight.
You mentioned law enforcement, and one of the big issues, the quote-unquote October surprise of this election, came from the FBI and announcing it was reopening the investigation of Secretary Clinton, and the agency became a lightning rod for criticism from both sides in the waning days of the election. How does that affect the FBI's relationship with the new president, or just its ability to do its business?
Jim Comey, first of all, has a 10-year term. A president could remove him without cause, but that would be that would be unprecedented, really, and I'd be surprised to see that happen. I'm sure there'll be some awkwardness between Mr. Comey and President Trump in the early days, given what happened at the end of the campaign. But Mr. Comey is a very respected law enforcement professional, and I expect that he will continue in the job. And while many questioned his judgment with respect to the public disclosure of aspects of the email investigation, I think he'll be able to continue in his job, and President Trump will find a way to work with him.
So again, you don't think there's any chance that he loses his job under, at least in the near future, but from President Trump?
I don't think so.
We have another question from one of our listeners, and the question is, what is, if any, are there legal consequences for a member of the Electoral College not following, I guess, the vote that the state has given?
Right. This is the legendary. These are the legendary faithless electors. I've heard speculation about this. It seems to me, again, highly unlikely that the Electoral College would result in something other than a Trump presidency, in part because the margin is growing. As I understand it, Arizona has been called for Donald Trump, and so he now has 290 electoral votes. Michigan seems to be leaning his way, and that's another 16 electoral votes. So you would have to have, more than 30 faithless electors, and these are individuals who signed up to be Trump electors. So it just seems highly unlikely that so many of them would have a change of heart at this stage.
Are there any other criminal justice or legal issues you'll be looking at the start of a Trump administration?
Well, we're certainly interested to see whether the FBI comes to Maryland. As you know, that was a key question. It wasn't resolved in this administration. We certainly think that our students at the University of Baltimore would benefit from having the FBI nearby, since many of them find jobs with the FBI. And so in Greenbelt or Landover, the FBI would find a good home. So that's one key issue. In general, I think we'll be looking at many policies with respect to criminal enforcement. Here in Maryland, we have a medical marijuana program. Is President Trump going to change what has been a hands-off approach from the Obama administration to those medical marijuana and recreational marijuana programs around the country? We may see something different in a new administration. So those are two things that come to mind that the new president will have to grapple with.
Yeah, you mentioned recreational marijuana, and that might have been one of the bigger winners of Tuesday's election, as more states are now legalizing recreational use of marijuana, which I guess will have an effect on drug policies both at the state level and perhaps at the national level. Right, and it's been this, sort of glaring disconnect between federal law, which not only outlaws marijuana, but treats it as a Schedule I drug. This afternoon, we have a symposium here at the law school on this very subject, looking at the medical marijuana program here in Maryland.
and I think we're going to have to see whether this disconnect continues, or is it time to change federal law, or might the federal government start to use its supreme powers to prevent states from moving in the direction that they've been moving.
Well, Ron, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me with you.
Our next panelist is Howard Bank CEO Ann Scully. Ann has more than 30 years of experience in the banking industry, and in 2003 she headed the organizing team for Howard Bank, the first new bank to open in the county in 15 years, and which today, through several expansions, serves small and medium-sized businesses in Greater Baltimore. She is past chair of the Maryland Bankers Association and was chair of the Community Foundation of Howard County. Thanks for joining us, Ann.
Thanks for being here. Thanks.
Do you have any overall thoughts or insights regarding what we heard from voters on Tuesday and what it means to the banking and financial services industry in Maryland?
I have a number of thoughts, and what I'll try to do is toggle back and forth a little bit between the national implications and the Maryland implications, because banks, as you know, are heavily regulated primarily by federal regulators, but also by state regulators. And certainly what the banking industry and the community banking industry in particular has been looking at for the last few years is this rising level of inequality in the country. And it's not a left versus right question. It's really an up versus down, haves versus have-nots, and to some extent a rural and blue-collar versus urban and white-collar phenomenon. And we've been very focused on this from an affordability standpoint. And I think what we heard on Tuesday night loud and clear was that that level of inequality is speaking out. And we saw that certainly in the national results, but if you pick away at the Maryland results, we saw as well not quite as much uniform support for the Democratic Party and some liberal policies, but rather some groundswells in rural areas. So I think that what we will have, first of all, with a united national legislature and administration, a Republican president and a Republican Congress for the first time in a number of years, we should see less friction, despite the fact that there is divisiveness within each party. There are a lot of career duties to be paid as a result of the groundswell of support. And I think that will hopefully mean that some of the deregulation talk, some of the focus on tax policies that might better benefit some of our small and medium-sized business customers, especially those that are privately owned, will be more likely to come about than reach an impasse as they have recently.
One of the issues that might come up under the Trump administration in terms of deregulation is Dodd-Frank, the sweeping financial industry regulatory law. It's still being defined, still being worked out. What reforms or changes to the law would you like to see?
There are a number of them, and I always preface this by saying that I'm certainly a big, advocate of regulation. Any industry that's using insured deposits from retail customers to fund small and medium-sized business loans needs to be regulated. You noted in your preface in that question that the law has not really been totally fully implemented. And to some extent, when it was implemented, it was not always totally well thought out. So I think the first thing that we'd like to see is to have a review of some of the implementations that have occurred. And then what I'd like to see is some of a greater concern about the unintended consequences of Dodd-Frank on consumer and small business access to credit. Some of the mortgage reform legislation, while well-intended, has resulted in even more significant disclosure requirements, euphemistically known as the TRID, and arbitrary debt-to-income ratios, prohibitions against certain types of credits that would allow you to look past an immediate situation. So we'd like to see that change. I think we'd certainly like to see less of a one-size-fits-all and a little bit more focus on the fact that not all banks have the same capacity to, for example, go through detailed stress level testing. And there is now in Congress, and has been in both houses of Congress, some regulatory relief in the form of either the Financial Regulatory Improvement Act or in the House known as the Choice Act. And I think that the first thing that all of the banking associations and the bankers would like to see is passage of that regulation. But I note that it wasn't necessarily the administration that prevented the passage of that to date. So again, my hope is that a more unified atmosphere, more than anything, will allow legislation that's been sitting in the halls of Congress for well over a year to actually move forward, and that really revolves around this not one size fits all.
So do you think that with the Trump administration, the passage of the Financial Regulatory Improvement Act is more likely to happen?
I think that it should be because of the greater sense of we're all on one page. But again, I don't directly attribute that to a new administration because this was not legislation that got held up in the White House. This was legislation that couldn't be reconciled between the two houses of Congress.
And a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to pass them along, and we'll ask Mary Ann. One thing I wanted to touch on was the ABA has expressed concerns about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and how it's set up its consumer complaint operation. How do you feel about how it's set up, and are there other changes that should be made to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau?
Well, I think the ABA has correctly expressed concern about more than just the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's consumer complaint operation. The CFPB, as you know, was established without the normal sort of legislative oversight that other federal regulators are subject to. It was an administration appointment, and I think the first thing that everybody would like to see is more congruence with the way the other federal regulators operate, because the CFPB has to some extent been ruling recently through enforcement actions. Secondly, the CFPB was designed primarily to deal with larger institutions, and yet the force and the weight that it has caused all of their regulations to impact all banks of all sizes. In terms of the consumer complaint operation, banks certainly want to know when a customer is unhappy with us. The problem with the CFPB consumer complaint operation is that every single complaint is published, whether it is justified or not, whether it has been reconciled or not, and there's absolutely no interaction between the financial services institution and the CFPB before those consumers' complaints are published. So it's a bit of a one-sided picture, which doesn't necessarily present all of the facts. But my belief, and I think all of the banking industry, has a higher level of concern with the CFPB, and starting with the way they are governed, if you will.
I'd like to move from the election to the state upcoming General Assembly session in Annapolis. Are there any issues pertaining to community banks, such as Howard Bank, that you think should be addressed in Annapolis during the session?
Well, I'm sure there will be a number of issues that will pertain to community banks. Our state legislature has tended to be very active as they focus on consumer concerns, and we'll continue to work with them. Obviously, the state legislature is one that we know well. The only change that's really happening, and it's not directly related to the election, is that there is some committee turnover on the Maryland State Banking Committee, so we'll be looking at that. But some of the things that are on the agenda from last year would be focused on continuing mortgage issues, trying to make sure that there's a registry of foreclosed properties so that we can work better with local authorities and they with us if they're concerned about a foreclosed property. Questions around technical issues like custodial accounts, working with the legislature on issues like student loan refinancing, looking at access to small business financing and minority financing. ongoing discussions about PACE loans or energy loans and their lien positions. So I can tell you as a former chair of the Maryland Bankers Association, there's always a long laundry list of issues that we know will come forward with the state legislature. But a number of them are going to revolve around these mortgage issues, these small business issues, the student loan issues, and then some of these energy financing issues.
How does what happens at the state legislative level interact or interplay with what's happening or what happens at the federal level in the banking industry?
It's not a tethered relationship, if you will. I mean, as a hallmark of this country, obviously, states' rights, and so the state legislature tends to move at its own pace and in its own direction. When we had a more democratic congressional delegation on a national level, you might have seen a little bit more lockstep, but I would say that there's not necessarily a direct relationship. Those are strategic partnerships and advocacy relations that the banking industry really needs to manage very independently of one another.
We have a question from someone in the audience, and it goes back to the federal regulations we were talking about. And the question is, why would unification in Congress allow these regulations to move forward when it was the Republican faction that held it up to begin with?
Well, I think that it's because there's a different day in Congress right now, and I think if one looks at not just the individual players, but the composition of who won seats, as well as the fact that, as Paul Ryan would have noted, the fact that the majority has been maintained to some extent due to a groundswell that was led by President-elect Trump, means that the president's clear predilection for deregulation is one of the ways that he thinks that the economy can revive and that job creation can thrive. I think that his focus on deregulation will help in Congress.
One thing the Obama administration has done is promulgated rules that require financial advisors to operate as fiduciaries in dispensing advice, to essentially be required to legally act in the client's best interests. How have you seen that being played out so far? We're not providers of uninsured product financial advice ourselves, so what I tell you would come from our interaction with strategic partnerships that we have with financial advisors. I think that first and foremost, there's a great deal of care that's being taken in making sure that the rules are understood, constant training and retraining. Unfortunately, I think at a global level, some movement to robotic investing to try to reduce some of the liabilities, some further consolidation in the industry because there are certain small players that have definitely been impacted by this, especially those who might be ancillary parts of non-financial services companies. But fiduciary advice and the role of a fiduciary is not news. It's simply the definition that, as you note, the Obama administration provided on how they defined fiduciaries that was a departure point. So like banking, just a lot of focus on the regulations and training, and then some perhaps unintended fallout in the way of consolidation. Your bank, Howard Bank, recently passed a milestone and now has $1 billion in assets. And Howard Bank has been aggressive in originating loans, and you said that will continue. Is the climate for supporting small business development getting more favorable?
Well, again, we have an administration that seems to be very focused on business and seems to be very focused on job creation, and that is certainly good. I think that we have some particular challenges in Maryland, and was a member of the Augustine Commission and was very, very happy to see the Hogan administration pursue all of the recommendations of that commission around less regulation, and a number of commissions that have been set up to deal with that on an ongoing basis. And that's very important to small businesses. There's still more work to be done in the legislature on the tax issues, especially for pass-through entities. So I think that the climate is getting more favorable, but there is also much more work to be done. And clearly, I believe with some bias, the most important thing for the state to focus on at the administration and at the legislative level is retaining and growing small businesses that are already here.
You've spoken about entrepreneurship, being entrepreneurial, and stepping out to create new businesses on your own, people going out and doing that. Do you think there's a role for entrepreneurs in shaping and participating in public policy debates?
Well, I personally believe there's always a role for entrepreneurs because at the end of the day, entrepreneurs are those who are dissatisfied with the status quo, and more significantly, those who believe that just because something is not broken does not mean that it shouldn't be fixed. So certainly there's a role. I would say when it comes to public policy debates, there's also just in general a role not only for entrepreneurs but for more business-savvy individuals to participate in those discussions and to participate in them on both sides of the divide, if you will. So I would be a huge advocate for having more business-savvy legislators, and then clearly for having all legislators be provided with more access and being open to more access and more input from the business community.
Well, Mary Ann, thank you very much for your time and your insights. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Our final panelist, Carmel Rokes, is not with us at the moment. We're trying to get a hold of her. But in the meantime, I believe our government reporter, Brian Sears, is listening. Brian, are you there?
I am.
You wrote today in our paper about the effect of the Trump's election on Governor Hogan, or what effect it could have on Hogan both now and in the future. What were you hearing from the people you talked to about Hogan, who did not support Trump, made it clear that he was not going to support Trump, but now that Trump has won, how will that affect, you think, the Hogan administration and his political future?
So to set the stage, it's interesting to note that not only did the governor not support Trump, not endorse him, he didn't vote for Trump, and he also didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. Instead, he made it clear that he voted for someone who he felt was very important in teaching him about integrity of holding public office, and that was his father. So he wrote in his father. In regards to your question. I think Republicans and some Democrats sort of see this as a potential opportunity for Democrats in 2018, mostly because Hogan won, and I think there was some expectation that this would work out better for the governor if Hillary Clinton had won, mostly because what generally tends to happen is that when you go into the midterm elections, which will also be occurring during the 2018 gubernatorial season, the party that's in power in D.C., there tends to be sort of this down ballot effect. It hurts the party in power, and so there is a concern that could affect Hogan. The question sort of remains, Danny, about whether or not Democrats can organize effectively to take advantage of this opportunity, however big it ends up being.
Because Hogan's still hugely popular in the state, and no matter what happened nationally, he's still popular among both Republicans and Democrats, correct?
That's correct. He's got a 71, maybe a little higher approval rating according to the last two polls that we've seen. And interestingly enough, Goucher College's poll a couple of months ago had some real interesting numbers that showed that the governor's lack of support or endorsement for Donald Trump really not only didn't hurt him, but in some respects may have helped him across the board. There also seems to be some debate about whether or not Republicans who are particularly irritated about the lack of endorsement for Donald Trump will ultimately stay away from Hogan. As one of the people I interviewed, put it to me, where else are they going to go?
Have you gotten any reaction or response from people you talked to in Annapolis about the election? Were they surprised? What was the general reaction?
Yeah, look, I think among the majority party there was a lot of surprise. I mean, this is, in Maryland, this is a state that is a blue state, regardless of the fact that we have a Republican governor, and this is a state that went heavily for Hillary Clinton as expected, went heavily for Chris Van Hollen in the Senate as expected. I mean, those polls ran pretty true to forecast. And look, I mean, among the folks in the Annapolis echo chamber, I mean, there was a heavy amount of support for Hillary Clinton, right. And just judging by my social media feeds, I'll tell you, Danny, that there's a lot of angst and upset, hurt feelings over the results from Tuesday night.
We have a couple of minutes with Brian, so if you have any questions for him about the impact of the election on state politics, please feel free to ask them. How do you think this will affect, if at all, what happens in Annapolis come January?
I think that remains to be seen. I think that the coming session is probably going to look like the first two, where Democrats are going to try very hard to try and pin the governor down on some issues that they can use to run against him on in 2018. That was a tactic that they used with Robert Ehrlich. They had a lot of success doing that, but the governor has proven to be pretty adept. He's not, he's got more political skill, I think, than most people gave him credit for when he first started running in 2014. And the fact of the matter is he has shown himself to be extremely disciplined when it comes to just not talking about issues that he doesn't want to talk about. And we saw that with the campaign against Anthony Brown.
A question from one of our listeners about Hogan. Why do you think the governor declined to use the federal funds for the Red Line?
Look, I don't know that I can speak to why he declined to use the federal funds. I think that really is tied up in the larger question of why the governor decided to not move forward. And the governor, to use his words, the governor felt that this was a boondoggle. He had serious questions. He enunciated those questions pretty clearly in terms of building a mile long, building this tunnel under Baltimore City. This was a tunnel that I think initially was estimated to be about $1 billion, which is almost half of the projected initial cost. This project kept getting more expensive, and I think that nobody that I talked to actually believed that $2.9 billion for the project or $1 billion for the tunnel were ultimately the final cost for either one of those.
One last question for you. Kathy Szeliga, she lost in her race for the Senate seat against Chris Van Hollen, so she goes back now to Annapolis State Senator, things just as they were before?
Yes, she does. She was not required to give up her seat in order to run. She will go back to Annapolis, and she will hold her seat and be eligible to run in 2018 if she desires.
Brian, thank you very much for chatting about the election and effect on Maryland. We'll be reading you going forward, especially come January when the session begins again.
Thanks so much.
This will wrap up today's webinar. Unfortunately, Carmel Rokes cannot join us. We'll hope to get her back on a future webinar to talk about the impact of the Trump administration on health care, the Affordable Care Act, and those related topics. We'd like to thank Keswick, though, for sponsoring this hour-long webinar. The webinar will be posted on our website if you want to watch it or hear it again at some point in the near future. And as a thank you for joining us today, we're offering you a one-year digital access subscription to the Daily Record for only $99. That's $70 off the regular subscription price. You'll find the promo code in the email we sent you prior to the webinar and in a follow-up email you will receive soon. Thanks again to all who joined us this afternoon, and have a nice day.